Margaret, remembered by history as Saint Margaret of Scotland, Queen Consort of Alba, and the patron saint of Scotland. She was born into a dynasty that had lost everything, a royal house without a throne, wandering through foreign courts on the quiet hope that one day England would call them home. She grew up far from the land her blood was meant to rule, raised instead in the devout, careful atmosphere of a kingdom that had only recently found God. And when England finally did call, it was already too late. Her father arrived, and then he died. The crown went to someone else, and then a conqueror came across the water, and the world she had known collapsed entirely. She fled, carried by storm, or by desperate calculation, to a cold and distant kingdom at the edge of the known world, ruled by a warrior king who spoke a language she would never learn. She had wanted only God. Instead, she was given Scotland. And Scotland, it turned out, was exactly what she was for. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm, complete story of Saint Margaret of Scotland, an English princess of ancient royal blood who arrived in Scotland as a refugee, married a warrior king, and spent the rest of her life quietly reshaping a nation. Born in a Hungarian castle, raised in an English court, widowed in a besieged fortress, and remembered nearly 1,000 years later as the patron saint of the country she never planned to call home. We will softly explore her full journey, from the long years of exile in Hungary, to the royal court of Edward the Confessor, to the night her world changed forever at the Battle of Hastings, from her reluctant marriage to Malcolm III in a cold Scottish castle, to the churches she built and the reforms she fought for, and the people she fed with her own hands every single day before she allowed herself to eat. And finally, to those last quiet days in Edinburgh Castle, when the news came from the south, and she held her cross and let go, told slowly and with care, to help guide you toward a restful sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about your favorite moment in Margaret's story help keep these tales coming for our growing family. And now, let us begin. To understand Margaret, we must begin not with her, but with the kingdom she never quite had, and the long chain of loss that shaped everything she would become. England, in the early years of the 11th century, was a land under extraordinary pressure. The great dynasty of Wessex, the royal house that had given England Alfred the Great and Athelstan, that had survived the worst the Viking Age could deliver and built from those ruins a genuine, literate, legally organized kingdom, was fighting to hold a throne that foreign ambition would simply not stop reaching for. The Danish kings had decided, over the course of a generation, that England was worth more than raiding. It was worth owning. At the center of this story, for our purposes, is a man named Edmund. Edmund Ironside, the son of Ethelred II, the king history calls the Unready, a nickname that captures not laziness but a certain unhappy inability to meet each new crisis with sufficient force. Ethelred had spent his reign paying Danish armies to go away, a policy that worked temporarily but at enormous cost, financial and psychological, to the kingdom. The payments were called Dangeld, and they became larger with each repetition, as the Danish commanders learned that England would pay rather than fight. His son Edmund inherited this exhausted kingdom and, unlike his father, was determined to fight. Edmund Ironside was a formidable man in the most physical sense. The name was not ironic. He fought Knut of Denmark in a series of engagements across England in 1016 that ranged from Mercia to Essex, neither side able to deliver the decisive blow. The two men were so evenly matched, so equally determined, that in the end they did something that surprised the historians of later centuries. They made a deal. Edmund would rule Wessex, the southern heartland. Knut would take the north. They would divide England between them, and perhaps in time something stable might grow from the arrangement. History did not give the arrangement time to prove itself. In November of 1016, Edmund Ironside died. He was perhaps 27 years old. The cause was never satisfactorily explained. Some accounts suggested illness, others whispered of something worse. The timing, from Knut's perspective, was strikingly convenient. Whatever the cause, Edmund's death handed Knut everything. There was no longer a divided England. There was simply Knut's England. Edmund left behind two very young sons. Their names were Edmund and Edward. They were small boys, barely old enough to speak clearly, let alone mount any kind of political resistance. And Knut faced the ancient dilemma of the conqueror who has defeated a dynasty. What to do with the children? They were too young to be threats themselves, but they would not always be young. If they survived and were given the chance to grow, they would become exactly the kind of figurehead that a displaced Saxon nobility could rally around. Knut needed them gone, but he also needed to avoid the political backlash that would follow an obvious act of cruelty against helpless children. He sent them away, far away. The boys were dispatched first to the court of King Olof Skötkonung in Sweden, far enough to be safe, too distant to be immediately useful to any English rebellion. But Sweden was only a way station. From there, over the years that followed, the brothers made their way still further east and south, eventually arriving in the Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary, in the middle of the 11th century, was, in its own way, one of the most extraordinary places in Christian Europe. It was a kingdom that had been comprehensively transformed within living memory. King Stephen of Hungary, a man who would himself eventually be canonized as a saint, had taken a collection of semi-nomadic Magyar tribes and built from them, through a combination of military authority, strategic marriage, and deliberate religious program, a Christian kingdom on the eastern frontier of the Latin world. He had invited Benedictine monks from across Europe to help him establish the church. He had aligned himself with the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor. He had given his kingdom a legal code. He had, in a single generation, changed almost everything about the society he ruled. And the atmosphere of that transformation, pious, serious, reform-minded, proud of its new Christian identity, still permeated the court that the two young English princes eventually reached. For boys with nothing but their blood and their prayers, it was perhaps the best possible place. Hungary valued exactly what they had: royal lineage and Christian formation. The younger brother, Edmund, died in Hungary. We do not know when or how. The records are silent, and we are left only with the fact of his absence from the story that follows. The elder brother, Edward, survived. He grew up in Hungary, was educated there, absorbed the deeply devotional atmosphere of the Hungarian court, and eventually, as a young man, made a life for himself within it. He found a wife, and here history presents us with one of its most stubbornly persistent mysteries. Her name was Agatha, and the question of who Agatha was, where she came from, whose daughter she was, what blood she carried, has occupied historians for several centuries without producing a settled answer. She was clearly a woman of considerable standing. The family she produced, the social world she moved in, the connections she maintained, all of these point to a woman of noble or royal descent. Beyond that, the sources disagree with remarkable enthusiasm. Some medieval chroniclers argue that she was related to Gisela, the wife of King Stephen himself, making her a connection of the Hungarian royal house. The Catholic Encyclopedia, drawing on these early sources, describes her as a kinswoman of Gisela. Other accounts, drawing on different medieval writers, suggest she was of German origin, a noblewoman from the German-speaking world, who had reached Hungary through the usual pathways of aristocratic and diplomatic connection. Still other medieval sources speak of Edward having resided at the court of a Kievan prince, and of Agatha being of Kievan Rus's royal blood, descended from the great princes of that Eastern Slavic dynasty. A scholarly study published as recently as 2022, after exhaustive review of everything the available sources contain, reached a conclusion that is honest if unsatisfying. It is simply not possible to assign a specific parentage to Agatha with any scholarly confidence. The question remains open. It may always remain open. The medieval record does not have enough to give us a clear answer, and the various theories each have both evidence in their favour and evidence against them. What we can say, and what matters most for the story we are telling, is this: Agatha was a woman of genuine importance, of elevated birth, raised in a deeply Christian environment, and possessed of both the social standing and the personal formation to become the mother of a saint. She passed to her eldest daughter, along with royal blood of some kind and the careful manners of a noble household, a faith that was serious, personal, and deeply felt. That inheritance would prove to be the most consequential thing Agatha ever gave the world. Edward and Agatha had 3 children together, born in Hungary over the course of the 1040s. The eldest was a daughter, born around the year 1045, most likely at Castle Réka, near the town of Mexiknadast, in the southern Hungarian region of Transdanubia. She was named Margaret. Then came a second daughter, Christina, and finally a son, Edgar, who would grow up carrying the entire accumulated weight of English royal expectation that history kept attempting to load onto every surviving member of the exiled Wessex line. Margaret's earliest years were spent in Hungary, at Castle Réka, and at the Hungarian court to which her family was connected. Life in that environment, for the children of a noble household embedded in a royal court, would have meant a structured world of religious formation, careful education, and the social rhythms of a Christian court that took its faith genuinely seriously. The Benedictine monks who had helped Stephen build the Hungarian church were still present and influential throughout this world. The rule of St. Benedict, its daily cycle of prayer and labour, its emphasis on communal life ordered around the divine office, its vision of the monastery as a school of the Lord's service, was the organizational framework around which much of the institutional church had built itself, and it was, quite literally, the air that Margaret breathed from the very beginning of her conscious life. She was, by every account that survives, an unusually devout child. Her earliest biographer, Turgot, the Benedictine monk and prior of Durham, who would later become her confessor and the closest witness we have to her inner life, described her in terms that suggest not merely piety as performance, but something deeper and more genuine, a natural orientation toward God, a quality of attention and stillness that made her, even as a girl, seem to those around her like someone whose center of gravity was located elsewhere than in the things most people chased. He compared her to Mary of Bethany, who sat at the feet of Christ and listened, who chose the contemplative attention over the busy activity, who found in the presence of God not duty, but delight. It was a temperament that would define her for the rest of her life, through all the noise and complexity and political danger that followed, and there was a great deal of all 3. That quality of inner stillness seems to have remained constant, the still point around which everything else revolved. But the world was about to become very loud, because in England, the childless King Edward the Confessor, Margaret's great-uncle, the king who had reclaimed the Wessex throne after the deaths of Knut's sons, was growing old, and the question of who would follow him was becoming impossible to ignore any longer. And somewhere in the discussions around the confessor's court, an idea had formed. Why not bring the exile home? The summons reached Hungary sometime around the year 1056. It came from England, and it carried the weight of royal authority. Edward the Confessor, King of England, wished his great-nephew to return. After decades of wandering, a childhood in Sweden, a manhood in Hungary, Edward the Exile was being called back to the land his grandfather had ruled. The reasoning was straightforward. Edward the Confessor had no children. His marriage to Queen Edith had produced no heirs, whether through choice or circumstance. As he aged, the question of the English succession grew more pressing with every passing season. William of Normandy, the formidable Duke of that northern French duchy, was watching England with the focused attention of a man who believed he had a legitimate claim to the throne and was preparing, quietly and methodically, to press it. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in the English kingdom, was watching too, with rather more immediate and practical intent. Against all of these competing claimants, there was one argument that the old Saxon tradition of succession could not easily dismiss: blood. Edward the Exile was the direct male line descendant of Edmund Ironside and of Ethelred and of the whole long Wessex dynasty going back to Alfred. His claim was, by the rules that the Saxon world understood, stronger than anyone else's. If he could be brought to England, formally acknowledged, given time to be known to the great men of the kingdom, the succession might be settled in a way that avoided the chaos that every medieval vacuum of power tended to produce. And so, Edward the Exile gathered his family. He and Agatha prepared for the journey, brought together whatever a noble household could carry, and set out westward across the width of Europe, through Central Europe, through the German-speaking lands, across the Channel, and into England. With them came their 3 children, Christina, young Edgar, and Margaret, who was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, and who had never in her conscious life set eyes on the country whose crown she carried in her blood. She spoke English, that much was certain. It was her father's tongue, the language of his identity and his inheritance, the thing he had kept alive through all the years of Hungarian exile as a kind of portable homeland, the living proof that he had not forgotten what he was and where he was from. The family had maintained English as their primary language, even in Hungary, a small but meaningful act of cultural preservation that would prove consequential later, when Margaret found herself queen of a Gaelic-speaking court and needed to bridge 2 worlds. But the country itself was entirely new to her. The particular quality of English light and English landscape, the customs of the English court, the rhythms of Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical life, all of it was foreign in a way that Hungary, the only home she had ever known, was not. She arrived in England in 1057, and then, within days, her father died. Edward the Exile died on the 19th of April, 1057. He was perhaps 41 years old. The cause remains to this day unexplained in any way that satisfies historical scrutiny. He had made the entire journey from Hungary apparently in good enough health. He arrived at the English court, and then he was dead. The timing was so convenient for those who had reasons to prefer a different succession that darker explanations attached themselves to his death almost immediately. Poison was whispered, as it generally was in the medieval world. When someone inconvenient died at an inconvenient moment. Most historians today are appropriately cautious. Sudden death from natural causes was genuinely common in the 11th century, but the coincidence was striking enough to be noted at the time, and it has never been explained away entirely. For Margaret, the loss was immediate and devastating. She was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, in a country she had never seen before, and her father was gone. Her brother Edgar was suddenly the most politically sensitive child in England, the nominal heir of Wessex, the boy around whom any Saxon resistance to Norman or Danish ambition might crystallize, which made him valuable to some people and dangerous to others, and neither of those things made life simple for a fatherless family in a foreign court. Her mother Agatha was now a widow in a country not her own, with 3 children to protect and no particular power of her own, beyond the reflected significance of the family name. The confessor took them in. He was a pious, and by the accounts that survive, a genuinely kind man, and he provided for the bereaved family with what appears to have been real consideration, rather than merely formal obligation. Margaret and her siblings were given a place at the English court, housed and educated, maintained in a style appropriate to their rank. Edgar was kept close and treated as a potential heir. Christina was already, in those early years, gravitating toward the religious vocation that would eventually make her an abbess, and Margaret continued to grow in the way she had always grown, quietly, attentively, with her prayers and her reading, and her deepening certainty that the purpose of a human life was the service of God expressed in the service of other people. She spent 9 years at the English court after her father's death, from 1057 to 1066. We have very few detailed records of this period of her life. It is one of the persistent gaps in her biography, and we are forced to be careful about what we claim to know. What Turgot's account makes clear is that these were years of continued and deepening formation. She was educated, well educated, by the standards of a royal household, in the Latin language and the scriptures and the devotional literature that formed the core curriculum of a serious 11th century religious education. She attended the daily offices of the church. She absorbed the particular quality of piety that characterized the confessor's court, a court known for its genuine religious seriousness, even if it was not always politically effective. She was, by all appearances, becoming precisely the woman she would later show herself to be, deeply learned in the things of God, quietly determined in the living out of her faith, already possessed of the clear and settled sense of purpose that would define her throughout her adult life. The years at the English court, however uncertain and precarious in political terms, gave her the time and the environment to complete that formation. And then, on the 4th of January, 1066, Edward the Confessor died. He left no unambiguous, legally settled heir. Various things had been promised or implied at various times to various people, and their relative validity was contested with considerable passion. Harold Godwinson moved with extraordinary speed, within a day of the confessor's death, by some accounts on the very same day, while the body was still being prepared for burial. Harold was crowned King of England at Westminster. It was a decisive, preemptive act, executed before anyone with a competing claim could organize a response. Edgar Atheling was not crowned. He was perhaps 15 years old, and the calculation of the Saxon nobility was not complicated. England in January of 1066 was a country that needed a king who could defend it, and a 15-year-old boy who had grown up primarily in Hungary was not that king. However impeccable his genealogy, Harold had the armies and the loyalty and the practical authority. He was crowned on the 6th of January 1066. He had 9 months to enjoy the crown before the world changed again. the summer of 1066 settled over England with a particular quality of dread that descends when everyone knows that something terrible is probably coming, but no one knows quite when or from which direction. Harold had done what he could. He had arrayed his forces along the southern coast, called out the Fyrd, the levied infantry of ordinary Englishmen who owed military service to the crown, positioned his fleet in the Channel. He waited through June and into July and through August, watching the horizon. The winds that would allow William's fleet to cross from Normandy refused to cooperate. The tensions stretched across weeks, and Harold's army, drawn heavily from men who had farms and families and harvests waiting, began, as the season turned toward autumn, to drift homeward. Then the danger came from the north. Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, landed with a substantial fleet on the Yorkshire coast, accompanied by Tostig, Harold's own brother, exiled the previous year and nursing a grievance that had curdled into something dangerous. Together they moved south, defeated a local English force at Gate Fulford, and took possession of York. Harold received the news and did something that military historians continue to find remarkable. He marched his army 300 miles north in approximately 4 days. He arrived at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September and launched an immediate assault on the Norse force, which had relaxed its guard in the aftermath of its recent victory. The battle was a complete and devastating English triumph. Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian threat ended in a single afternoon of fighting. 4 days later, William of Normandy landed on the English coast in the south. The winds had finally changed. Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched them back the length of England. He could have waited. He had options. He could have rested his men and called in reinforcements and confronted William from a position of greater strength. He chose instead to move quickly. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps he was confident. Perhaps he could not bear the image of William's forces burning through the English countryside while he rested in the north. Perhaps he simply had the kind of decisive instinct that does not calculate well when calculation would serve better. The Battle of Hastings was fought on the 14th of October, 1066, on a ridge in Sussex. It lasted most of a day, from early morning into the late afternoon, and for much of that time the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The English fought on foot, in the traditional Saxon manner, holding a shield wall on the crest of the ridge, and the Norman cavalry and archers threw themselves against that wall repeatedly without breaking it. There were moments when the English line seemed impregnable, and then Harold was killed, struck, tradition says, by an arrow, though the sources are not perfectly consistent on the details, and the line broke, and the Norman cavalry poured through. And by evening William of Normandy stood on an English field as the master of an English kingdom. In London, the great men of England met in the wreckage of everything they had known, and turned, as the old rules of Saxon succession demanded, to the blood of Wessex. They turned to Edgar Etheling. Edgar was 15 years old. He had the correct ancestry. He had nothing else, no army, no treasury, no military experience, no realistic mechanism for resisting the man who had just proven, beyond reasonable doubt, that he could not be stopped by wishful thinking or legitimate lineage. Within weeks, as William advanced on London and systematically devastated the surrounding countryside, burning, seizing hostages, cutting off food, the English nobility began, one by one, to ride out and submit. The archbishops submitted, the earls submitted, and Edgar himself, grasping the arithmetic of the situation with a clarity that his youth might have obscured, but apparently did not, relinquished whatever claim had been briefly pressed on his behalf. He submitted to William. He was received, watched, controlled, kept at court as a contained threat, not free but not obviously harmed. The Normans were efficient in this kind of management. They did not need to destroy Edgar. They simply needed to ensure that he never had the space or the resources to become dangerous. For Margaret and her mother Agatha, the calculation was of a different kind. They were women, which gave them a certain protection in the medieval reckoning of political threat, but they were also the family of the man around whom any future Saxon resistance would inevitably crystallize, and the new Norman administration was establishing itself across England with a thoroughness that left very little room for the comfortable survival of people who were, however passively, symbols of what had been displaced. The old Saxon world was ending. The old Saxon lords were being replaced. The old Saxon language was being pushed out of the courts and the chanceries. Every day that passed made the position of Edward the Exile's family more precarious. Agatha decided they would leave. The traditional account, the one told in devotional sources and in the chronicles closest to the events, the one that became embedded in the popular memory of Scotland for 1,000 years, says that Agatha intended to sail back to Hungary. She gathered her children, Margaret and Edgar and Christina, and they boarded a ship, and they set out. But a fierce storm caught them at sea, and the ship was driven northward, off course, battered by wind and wave, until it was brought to shore, not in Hungary or anywhere near it, but on the coast of Scotland. Some historians, reading this account with the skepticism that the miraculous tends to attract, have suggested that the storm may be more story than history. It was politically useful, they argue, for the family to appear to have arrived in Scotland accidentally, driven by forces beyond human control, rather than deliberately seeking the protection of a king who had his own very clear political reasons for wanting Edgar Atheling under his roof. Malcolm III of Scotland had everything to gain from hosting the nominal legitimate heir of England, and the story of a providential storm made the whole arrangement look less like calculation and more like the hand of God. We cannot know which version of events is true. The seas around Britain in the late autumn are genuinely violent, and navigation in the 11th century was imprecise enough that being driven off course was far from impossible. Perhaps the storm was real. Perhaps it was legend that attached itself to a significant arrival. Perhaps it was somewhere in between. What we know with certainty is this. Sometime in 1068, the family of Edward the Exile arrived in Scotland, and they were received by Malcolm III, King of Scots, and something about that reception, something about the meeting between a warrior king and a quiet, composed young woman who had never wanted to be a queen, was about to change two lives, and through those two lives, a kingdom. Malcolm III of Scotland was not a simple man, but he was a direct one. He was the son of Duncan the Fairsoon, the same Duncan whose death at Macbeth's hands had made him, as a small child, the exiled heir to a usurped throne. He had grown up at the court of Siward, Earl of Northumbria, in the Anglo-Saxon world of the north of England, educated there, formed there, given the cultural fluency in English language and custom that would later make his court the natural destination for displaced Saxon nobility. He had waited, as exiled kings must, for his moment. It came in 1054, when, with Siward's military support and the blessing of Edward the Confessor, he returned to Scotland and began the campaign that would, over the next 3 years, end in the deaths of Macbeth, and then of Macbeth's brief successor Lulach, and in Malcolm's own undisputed coronation as King of Scots. He was a warrior king in the clearest and most complete sense of that phrase. He had killed 2 predecessor kings in the course of obtaining his throne. He had led armies across the English border on raids that left considerable devastation behind them. He was physically imposing, accustomed to command, not notably given to the intellectual or the spiritual in his own personal inclinations. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, capable of genuine loyalty and of a kind of uncomplicated personal devotion that would, in the context of his marriage, prove to be one of the most defining facts about him. He had been married before, to Ingiborg, the widow of Thorfinn, the Earl of Orkney, whose political importance to the Scottish north made the match strategically sensible. Ingiborg had died around 1069 or 1070. Malcolm was a widower when the family of Edward the Exile arrived on his shore. He saw Margaret. She was perhaps 22 or 23 years old. She was, by the accounts that survive, beautiful in the way that her era considered most striking. Composed, graceful, clearly well-bred, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of a woman raised in courts. But what seems to have struck Malcolm, and what Turgot's account conveys with particular care, was something that went beyond appearance. She had a quality that her contemporaries struggled to name precisely, but kept attempting to describe, a kind of visible interior depth, a settled seriousness of purpose, a quality of being fully present that made the people around her feel, in some instinctive way, that they were in the company of someone whose centre of gravity was located somewhere other than where most people's centre of gravity was located. She was, in the language her world understood, visibly holy, not in a performative or demonstrative way, not wearing her piety on the outside for effect, but in the more fundamental sense of someone whose entire orientation, in every small choice and every large one, was unmistakably toward God. Malcolm was not a spiritual man in any formally systematic sense, but he was not insensible to extraordinary things. He saw Margaret, and he wanted to marry her. He said so. Margaret did not want to marry him. This moment in her story matters, and it is worth holding it carefully rather than rushing past it. Margaret's reluctance was not the conventional modesty of a well-bred young woman performing the expected hesitation before accepting what she already intended to accept. It was genuine, deep, and consistent. She wanted to be a nun. She had wanted this since childhood. The contemplative life, the enclosed, structured, God-directed life of a woman in religious vows, was what she had always imagined for herself. It was what her sister Christina would eventually choose and fulfill. The convent, the daily offices, the uninterrupted relationship with God. This was the life Margaret wanted. She had never expressed any desire to be a queen. Malcolm persisted. He was a king, and kings who wanted things had a certain natural advantage in the getting of them, particularly when they were offering marriage, a genuine social elevation, a real security, the kind of alliance that changed a family's position significantly. The circumstances of the family as a whole were also a factor in the eventual outcome. They were entirely dependent on Malcolm's protection. Edgar's political future was tied directly to Malcolm's sponsorship and goodwill. Agatha was a widow in a foreign country with no obvious alternatives. Christina was heading toward her convent. Margaret was the member of the family most logically positioned for the kind of strategic alliance through marriage that medieval political life required. She eventually agreed. Turgot's account, which reflects what Margaret herself shared with him in the intimacy of confession, makes clear that once she had agreed, the marriage was entered into with her full self, that she brought to it everything she brought to everything else she believed in, completely and without reservation. And the life that followed bears this out. She did not become a reluctant or resentful queen. She became one of the most remarkable queens in Scottish history. Malcolm and Margaret were married in 1070 at the castle of Dunfermline. The ceremony was conducted by Fothard, the Celtic bishop of St. Andrews. a detail that quietly anticipates the great project of Margaret's queenship, since the Celtic Christianity that Bishop Fote had represented was precisely what she would spend the next 2 decades working to reform and reconnect to the wider church. He married them under the old rites of the Scottish Church, and she became Queen of Scotland, and whatever she had once imagined her life would be, this was now irrevocably what it was. She was perhaps 24 years old. Malcolm was perhaps 40. The warrior king and the princess from Hungary, brought together by exile and storm and the particular kind of attraction that sometimes forms between people who are almost entirely different from each other, were married, and Scotland waited to see what she would make of it. The Scotland that Margaret entered as its queen in 1070 was a country that was still, in many ways, in the process of becoming something. It was not unified in the way that England had become under the pressure of Viking threat and Saxon response. It was a patchwork of peoples, Gaelic Scots in the west and the Highlands, Britons in the southwest, Angles in the southeast, Norsemen in Caithness and Sutherland, and the northern and western islands, each speaking different languages, following different customary laws, practicing different traditions of worship, owing loyalty to different layers of authority. Malcolm's kingship was real and recognized, but it rested on personal authority and military strength as much as on institutional structure. The elaborate apparatus of centralized governance that was developing in Norman England had no real equivalent in Scotland. Things were done through personal loyalty, through the word of the king and of the chief, through the kind of direct relationship between ruler and people that required the ruler to be constantly present, visible, and physically convincing. The language of the court and of the Scottish nobility was primarily Gaelic. Margaret did not speak Gaelic and never would. This was not a trivial barrier for a woman who had arrived in Scotland with a clear and urgent sense of what she believed and what she wanted to say. She was cut off, linguistically, from the culture she was now meant to help govern. She navigated this through Malcolm, who had grown up between 2 linguistic worlds, English from his years at Siward's Northumbrian court, Gaelic as his native inheritance, and who served throughout their life together as her interpreter and her voice in the Scottish world. Malcolm's first visible act of accommodation toward his queen was a significant one. He decreed that English would be the language of the royal household. Gaelic would continue to be the language of the wider population, of the Highland clans, of the church in its Celtic practice. But in the palace at Dunfermline, in the rooms where Margaret and Malcolm lived and worked and raised their children, English would be spoken. It was a symbolic gesture as much as a practical arrangement, but symbols matter, and this one mattered in ways that extended well beyond the household. It began the slow process of tilting the Scottish court toward the Anglo-Saxon cultural world, a process that would accelerate under Margaret's influence and reach its fullest expression in the reigns of her sons. The cultural transformation that Margaret brought to the Scottish court went considerably further than language. She had been raised at the court of Edward the Confessor, a court that, for all its political fragility, had developed a certain sophistication in matters of ceremony, art, and ecclesiastical culture. She brought that sensibility north with her, introduced more elaborate court ritual, more considered approaches to display and decoration, more attention to the visual and ceremonial dimensions of royal authority. She established workshops in the palace where women were employed in the making of ecclesiastical embroideries, vestments for priests, decorative hangings for church walls, altar cloths worked in silk and gold. And she worked alongside those women herself, treating the making of beautiful things for God as a form of prayer, as genuine as any formal devotion. Malcolm found all of this, by the accounts that survive, not merely tolerable, but genuinely admirable. He was not a man for whom fine liturgical embroidery or elaborated court ceremony would have come naturally. He was a man of the field and the council, accustomed to the rough necessities of a kingdom that existed in a permanent state of military readiness. But his love for Margaret was wide and genuine, and it seems to have encompassed, without apparent strain, everything that she valued and cared about. Turgot tells a story that has become one of the most beloved details of their partnership. Malcolm could not read. Literacy was not among the achievements he had been given opportunity to acquire. And yet he loved books, or rather, he loved Margaret's love of books. He would sometimes take her favourite volumes from her and hold them carefully in his hands, turn them over, examine the illuminations with the attention of someone who cannot read the text, but understands that something precious is before him. When she told him that a particular book was especially dear to her, he would have it sent away to be bound in gold and silver, encrusted with gems, not because he could engage you with its contents, but because he loved her and wanted to honour the things she loved. It is a small story, but it illuminates the marriage with a warmth that no formal account can quite replicate. He also supported her in her charitable works in the most direct and physical way available to a king. He participated in them personally. Margaret lived her faith in a way that left very little of her body or her time uncommitted to it. During the seasons of Advent and Lent, the two great periods of preparation in the Christian year, she rose in the middle of the night to attend the night offices of the church. She prayed the canonical hours. She attended Mass every morning without exception, and before she ate anything herself, she served the poor, not through intermediaries, not through institutional provision alone, though she established that too. She served them personally, with her own hands, face to face, present to each individual she fed, with a directness and warmth that made the giving something more than distribution. Malcolm walked beside her in all of this. He washed feet, the evangelical practice that Margaret maintained as a regular discipline of humility, kneeling before the poor in conscious imitation of Christ, the warrior king of Scotland in the mud of a cold Scottish morning washing the feet of people his kingdom might otherwise have entirely overlooked. He gave coin at the castle gates. He stood quietly next to a woman whose vision of what a king and queen were for was so different from anything he had been taught. And he did not merely permit it or patronize it. He participated. His love for her was large enough to include her God. And if her God required the King of Scotland to kneel in the mud before breakfast, then kneel he did. Their life together, through the 1070s and into the 1080s, produced 8 children. The sons were Edward, Edmund, Ethelred, Edgar, Alexander, and David. The daughters were Edith, born around 1080, and Mary, born perhaps 2 years later. All 8 were raised in the Roman Catholic faith, with a depth and rigour that reflected everything Margaret valued about religious formation. She was not merely a mother to them. She was their teacher and their primary example of what faith looked like when it was lived all the way out to its edges. She was preparing kings, and she knew it, and she treated the education of her children as one of the most serious obligations of her queenship. She taught them that power was a responsibility, not a reward. She brought them into her charitable work so that they understood from childhood that the hands of a queen were for washing the feet of the poor. She ensured that their names, Edward, Edgar, Alexander, David, were names from the Wessex tradition she carried in her blood, a quiet but deliberate signal of the cultural inheritance she wanted them to hold. The Scotland she was building, slowly, without force, through persuasion and demonstration, and the example of a life lived completely according to its own convictions, was becoming, year by year, something different from what she had found. more connected to the Latin Christian world, more culturally sophisticated, more attentive to the relationship between the crown and the church, more English in its surface markers while remaining essentially Scottish in its bones. It was a transformation achieved not through imposition, but through love. Malcolm loved her, and loving her, he made it possible. The church that Margaret found in Scotland when she arrived as its queen in 1070 was ancient and sincere, and, in her considered view, seriously in need of reform. Some context is important here because it is easy to misread what Margaret was doing, and the misreading does no one any justice. The Celtic Christianity of Scotland was not a heresy. It was not a denial of Christ or a rejection of Scripture. It was not, in most of its deepest commitments, very far from the Latin Christianity that Margaret had grown up in. It was, rather, a branch of Christian practice that had developed in a degree of geographical and cultural isolation over several centuries, shaped primarily by the tradition of Columba, the great 6th century Irish saint who had founded the monastery on the island of Iona, and from there conducted one of the most extraordinary missionary campaigns of the early medieval world, and by the distinctive monastic culture that Columba and his successors had built across the islands and the western coasts of Scotland. That culture had real holiness in it. It had produced, in the early medieval centuries, some of the most remarkable works of Christian art and scholarship that the world has ever seen. The illuminated manuscripts of Iona and Lindisfarne, the Gospels written and decorated with a fineness of imagination and a precision of hand that continues to astonish the people who examine them 1,000 years later. It was a tradition that had carried the Gospel into the wildest and most remote places of the northern world, at a time when no other tradition was attempting anything like it. Its saints, Columba, Aidan, Cuthbert, were genuine figures of holiness, and their legacy was real, but it had grown insular. Its calendar differed from Rome's in the calculation of Easter. Not a trivial matter, since the dating of Easter determined the entire structure of the liturgical year, and a church that observed Easter on a different date from the rest of the Latin world was, in a very practical sense, worshipping on a different rhythm from the universal church. The Scottish Church also differed from Rome on the observance of Lent, on the proper form of the Mass, in certain specific regards, on some aspects of marriage law, and on the participation of the laity in the Eucharist. This last matter disturbed Margaret particularly. When she began to engage with the practice of ordinary Scottish Christians, the farmers and craftsmen and the women of the villages who made up the vast majority of Malcolm's kingdom, she found that many of them refused to receive communion at Easter. They considered themselves too sinful, too unworthy of approach, to accept the body of Christ at the holiest moment of the Church's year. In their humility, they had arrived at what Margaret understood as a profound theological error. The Eucharist, she argued, was not a reward for those who had earned it through sufficient virtue. It was a medicine for those who needed it, a gift given precisely to the weak and the struggling and the imperfect, which is to say, to everyone. To refuse it on grounds of personal unworthiness was to misunderstand entirely what it was for and what it was meant to do. She made this argument with warmth and with theological precision, and she kept making it. Margaret convened church councils, multiple councils, over the years of her queenship, formal assemblies of the Scottish clergy, bishops and abbots and senior priests gathered together in the presence of the king and queen, called to discuss specific questions of practice and to reach agreed resolutions. These were not casual conversations or informal discussions. They were structured, deliberate formal meetings, and Margaret prepared for them with the seriousness of a woman who understood that she was walking into theological argument with trained men, many of whom had a lifetime of Scottish practice behind them, and no particular initial inclination to accept the views of a foreign queen who had arrived from Hungary and England and considered their traditions backward. She studied, she read, she gathered her scriptural references and her citations from the Church Fathers, and her knowledge of the decisions of earlier church councils in the wider Latin world. She came to those assemblies with a brief that was carefully prepared and clearly argued, and Malcolm, who attended the councils as what Turgot calls their assessor and chief actor, being fully prepared both to say and do whatever she might direct in the matter at issue, translated her arguments from Latin and English into Gaelic, so that every member of the assembled clergy could follow what she was saying. That last detail about Malcolm deserves a moment of reflection. Here is a warrior king who has spent his life in the field and the council chamber, a man who killed 2 predecessor kings to claim his throne, who has led armies across the English border on raids that the Northern Chronicles record with understandable horror, sitting in formal ecclesiastical assembly, translating for his wife, and publicly committed in advance to supporting whatever position she takes. There is something in this that transcends the merely tactical. It speaks to the completeness of his trust in her judgment, and to the complete absence of the kind of masculine pride that would have prevented many men of his era and his type from ever being in that position at all. He believed in her, entirely, and that belief made possible things that would not otherwise have been possible. The reforms Margaret achieved through these councils were specific and practical, focused on the points of genuine divergence between Scottish practice and the practice of the wider church. The Easter calendar was brought into alignment with Roman calculation. Lent was to be observed in the standard manner. Sunday was to be treated as a day set apart for worship and rest, not a working day like any other. The marriage laws were corrected to prohibit what the Universal Church's canon law prohibited: marriage with a deceased brother's wife, marriage with a stepmother, certain other unions that the Celtic tradition had permitted, but that the wider church had determined were contrary to divine law. The laity were instructed and encouraged, and where necessary gently corrected, to receive communion at Easter. These were adjustments, not revolutions. They were the careful, patient work of bringing a partially isolated church back into full communion with its broader family, and they required persistence and intelligence and a genuine willingness to engage rather than simply command. Margaret also wrote letters. She was not merely working within Scotland. She was connecting Scotland to the broader world. Her most important correspondence was with Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the preeminent churchman of the English-speaking world, a Norman scholar of considerable intellectual distinction, who was one of the driving figures of the Gregorian reform movement reshaping Latin Christianity across Europe. She wrote to him about what she was attempting, described the specific conditions and needs of the Scottish Church, and asked him to send monks, Benedictine monks specifically, men trained in the rule of Saint Benedict, experienced in the daily rhythms of the divine office, capable of establishing the kind of sustained, ordered communal Christian life that Margaret believed was the most powerful vehicle of genuine religious renewal. Lanfranc sent them, 3 monks initially, arriving from Canterbury to establish what would become a priory at Dunfermline, a small community of Benedictine men setting up their cells and their chapel in a Scottish town, beginning the daily cycle of prayer and labour under the rule, planting the first formal monastery in Scotland's history. It was a modest beginning, but modest beginnings, properly tended, become large things. Under Margaret's son, David I, who ruled from 1124 to 1153, this priory would be elevated to a full Benedictine abbey, one of the most important religious establishments in medieval Scotland, a centre of liturgy and learning and pilgrimage that would shape the spiritual character of the kingdom for generations. Margaret also gave grants to the older Celtic monasteries. She supported the ancient community at Iona, the island that Columba had made sacred, the place from which the conversion of Scotland had radiated outward 6 centuries earlier. And she gave grants to the community at Lochleven. She refurbished dilapidated churches across the kingdom. She was not attempting to destroy the Celtic tradition. She was attempting to reform it and reconnect it, to build new structures alongside the old, rather than demolishing what had come before. She showed genuine respect for the deep roots of Scottish Christianity even as she worked to redirect its branches. And she built new things. At the narrowest crossing point of the Firth of Forth, where the great tidal estuary of the river narrows enough for a manageable boat crossing, she established a free ferry service for pilgrims travelling north to the shrines at Dunfermline and St Andrews. Before this, pilgrims had faced either a long detour around the head of the Firth or an expensive and sometimes dangerous paid crossing. Margaret arranged for the crossing to be free and for boats to be available. It was a practical act of charity, a direct and tangible provision for the poorest pilgrims who would otherwise have been unable to complete their journeys. The northern and southern ends of that crossing are called, to this day, North Queen's Ferry and South Queen's Ferry, names that have preserved her memory in the physical geography of Scotland for nearly 1,000 years, as durably as any church she built or charter she signed. And on the high black rock of Edinburgh, the great volcanic crag that commanded the approaches to the Scottish capital, the fortress from which Scotland was governed, she began to build a chapel, simple in its proportions, modest in its scale, careful and solid in its construction. St Margaret's Chapel still stands on that rock. It is the oldest surviving building in the whole of Edinburgh, older by far than anything else in the castle complex that has grown up around it over the centuries. It has been in more or less continuous use as a place of prayer for nearly 1,000 years. Visitors go to it today and they sit in it, and they feel what people feel when they sit in a very old place that has been prayed in continuously for a very long time. That is not nothing. That is, in its quiet way, everything. It is easy, in the telling of a saint's life, to let the institutional record crowd out the person. The church councils, the Benedictine priory, the free ferry crossing, the chapel on the Edinburgh Rock. These are the public achievements, the things that can be verified and placed on maps and traced through documentary evidence. They are real and they are important, but they are the public surface of a life whose most essential dimension was private, personal, and known primarily to those who were closest to her. We are fortunate that one of those people wrote it down. Turgot of Durham was Margaret's confessor, the man to whom she brought her innermost thoughts, her spiritual struggles, her prayers and her fears, and the texture of her daily practice, in the intimate disclosure of the confessional relationship. He knew her, in the fullest sense of that word, across many years of regular contact. He was not simply a biographer drawing on public record and hearsay. He was a witness, and the account he wrote of her inner life, commissioned by her daughter Matilda in the years immediately following Margaret's death, gives us something rare and precious, a portrait of a holy person from the inside. She slept very little. This is not a hagiographic formula or a conventional compliment to her asceticism. Turgot means it precisely. During the seasons of Advent and Lent, the two great periods of preparation in the Christian year, the weeks before Christmas and the weeks before Easter, Margaret rose in the middle of the night to attend the night offices of the church. Midnight, the small hours, the dark and cold of a Scottish winter, and Margaret rising from whatever brief rest she had managed to kneel again on stone and pray. She maintained this discipline year after year, through all the demands of her queenship, through 8 pregnancies, through the governance of a court and a kingdom, through the management of the church reform she was conducting, through the daily hours of charitable work that filled her mornings. She fasted severely. The details Turgot records make clear that her asceticism had real and cumulative consequences for her health. The reduced sleep, the restricted food, the physical demands of caring personally for hundreds of poor people, all layered on top of the biological demands of bearing and nursing 8 children over roughly 20 years. By the end of her life, the toll was obvious. She was a woman running on something other than physical reserves. She knew it. She continued anyway. But the asceticism was always paired with an outward movement of generosity toward other people. The midnight prayer was followed by morning charity. The personal fasting was accompanied by the feeding of others. Every act of self-denial found its counterpart in an act of provision for those who had nothing. She was not punishing herself. She was freeing herself, freeing the hours, the energy, the physical and spiritual resources that self-indulgence would have consumed, and directing everything that was free toward the people around her. She fed the poor personally before she ate herself, not symbolically, not once a year as a ceremonial gesture, but every day, as a regular practice that she maintained throughout her adult life. During times of particular hardship, she served 300 people a day with her own hands. She held orphan children in her arms. She stopped on her morning walks back from the early offices to give food and coin and direct human attention to the people gathered outside the castle gates, the beggars, the hungry, the wandering sick, who had learned that something might be given here, that the Queen's household was a place where no one left empty-handed. She washed feet. This was perhaps the most deliberately evangelical of all her charitable practices, the most obviously shaped by the gospel account of Christ washing his disciples' feet at the Last Supper. It was a practice of voluntary humility, the great Queen kneeling before the poor, in deliberate imitation of the act that the gospel presents as the defining gesture of Christian service. She did not perform this once a year as a formal ceremonial occasion. She performed it regularly as a discipline of the spirit, as a reminder to herself and to everyone around her of what the crown was actually for. And Malcolm knelt beside her. This detail, which Turgot records as a natural and unremarkable feature of their shared life, is in fact quite remarkable when held against everything else we know about Malcolm. He was a man who had gained his throne through killing, who maintained it through the threat of military force, who had raided the north of England 5 times and left devastation in his wake. He was not a gentle man by any obvious external measure. And yet, here, at the gates of his own castle on cold Scottish mornings, he was on his knees in the mud, washing the feet of beggars, because his wife believed this was what a good king did. His love for her encompassed not merely her ideas but her practice. He followed her all the way to the ground. Margaret's chamber was a workshop of sacred art. She employed women, possibly noble women, possibly craftswomen, possibly both, in the production of ecclesiastical embroideries, vestments for priests, decorative hangings for church walls, altar cloths worked in the finest materials available to a Scottish queen. She worked alongside these women herself. She treated the making of beautiful things for God as itself a form of prayer, a working devotion, a way of filling the hours of ordinary day with sacred purpose. She had absorbed from the Benedictine tradition the understanding that labour, properly oriented, was as holy as liturgy. Her love for books was deep and genuine. She was well educated, literate in Latin as well as English, capable of engaging with Scripture directly rather than only hearing it read, and she surrounded herself with manuscripts and devotional literature. Among her most cherished possessions was a beautifully illuminated gospel book, a finely decorated volume that she carried with her and used for her daily reading and prayer. Turgot records a story about this book that became one of the most celebrated in the whole tradition of Margaret's sanctity. At some point during her queenship, the gospel book was accidentally dropped into a river. When a soldier was sent to retrieve it, he found it, the story says, completely undamaged. The pages dry, the illuminations untouched, the binding unharmed, as though the river had declined to harm what the Queen loved. The story was recorded as a miracle. It was cited among the evidences of Her Holiness in the canonization process. The book itself is real, and it survives. It is held today at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, one of the world's great repositories of ancient manuscripts, and those who have examined it confirm that it is a genuinely fine gospel book of the 11th century, decorated with the care and artistry that speaks of someone who valued beautiful things in the service of faith. Whether the story of the river is history or beloved legend, and it belongs in the latter category, clearly pious and clearly cherished, but not verifiable by the methods of historical scholarship. The book is undeniably there. A small, physical, tangible connection across 9.5 centuries to the woman who prayed with it every day. She also possessed what she considered above all her earthly goods, the most precious thing in her keeping. It was called the Black Rood, and it was a reliquary, an ornamental container designed to hold a physical relic of a sacred person or sacred object. And what it contained was a fragment of the true cross, the wooden cross on which Christ had been crucified. Such relics were among the most venerated objects in all of medieval Christianity. The fragment was housed in a container of extraordinary beauty, the outer case made of black ebony, which gave the relic its name, and within it the container itself fashioned from gold, set with diamonds, with a figure of the crucified Christ carved in ivory. It was an object of sacred art and personal devotion in one, and Margaret carried it and prayed over it and held it as the physical center around which her entire devotional life organized itself. After her death, the Black Rood became one of the most sacred objects in the possession of the Scottish crown. It was not merely a personal relic, but a national one, carried into battle, displayed at moments of national significance, held as part of the regalia of Scottish kingship. The private devotion of one woman, maintained across 23 years of queenship, became in time the public symbol of a nation's faith. This is not an unusual trajectory for genuine holiness. It tends to expand outward. Turgot, who had known Margaret through all of this, who had seen the midnight prayer and the early morning charity, who had listened to her confess her fears and her hopes and the innermost movements of her spirit, wrote of her in words that carry the weight of long personal knowledge. Of all living persons I know or have known, she was the most devoted to prayer and fasting, to works of mercy and almsgiving. He was a Benedictine monk and prior who had spent his life in the company of serious religious people. This sentence was not a formula. It was a considered judgment from a man who had the comparison set to make it. The Scotland that Margaret was slowly, patiently, and thoroughly transforming was not a country living in peace with its neighbours, and the contrast between the interior life she was building and the external political world in which that life was embedded was sometimes sharp enough to be dissonant. Malcolm was an expansionist. He was a warrior king who had built his reign on military force and who understood the logic of medieval kingship in its most straightforward form. A strong king expands, and a king who does not expand becomes, eventually, a king who contracts. His eyes were drawn to the south, to the northern counties of England that had been contested territory between Scotland and the English kingdoms since the time of the old Bernician dynasty. He had territorial ambitions in Northumbria that predated his marriage to Margaret, and that her presence at his court did not diminish. He also had, after 1070, a political justification that he could deploy whenever convenient. His wife's brother, Edgar Atheling, was the legitimate heir of the old English royal line, and protecting Edgar's rights was something a right-thinking Christian king might plausibly do. Whether Malcolm's raids were genuinely motivated by concern for Edgar, or whether the fraternal solidarity was largely a pretext for what he would have done in any case, is not entirely clear. Probably there was truth on both sides. Genuine sympathy for Edgar mixed with convenient political cover for territorial raids that served his own ambitions. The ambiguity was useful, and he seems to have maintained it deliberately. He invaded England 5 times during his reign. The raids left genuine suffering in their wake. The chronicles of Northumbria during Malcolm's years describe a recurring pattern of burned villages and destroyed crops, of people taken in slavery, of the particular misery of communities that existed directly in the path of a Scottish army on its way south, and then on its way back north again, with plunder. The contrast between the Malcolm who washed feet at the castle gates at his wife's side, and the Malcolm who commanded these raids is real, and should not be dissolved into comfortable narrative. He was both things. People often are, especially when power is involved. The year of the marriage itself, 1070, was also the year of a particularly destructive raid into Yorkshire. It drew the full and serious attention of William the Conqueror, who had been occupied with the consolidation of his English kingdom and had not yet turned his considerable energies north. But the Yorkshire devastation changed his calculation. Scotland under Malcolm was not simply a remote northern kingdom that could be managed through benign neglect. It was a base for raids and for the harbouring of Saxon opposition, and it needed to be addressed. In 1072, William mounted a combined land and sea operation against Scotland, an invasion that demonstrated, as clearly as anything William did, what the full disciplined resources of the Norman military machine could achieve when properly directed. Malcolm's forces were not capable of meeting Norman heavy cavalry in the open field. The Scots were brave and experienced soldiers, but the disproportion of military capability was too great, and Malcolm was wise enough to understand what the battlefield arithmetic actually said. He did not seek a decisive engagement. He sued for peace. The settlement was reached at Abernethy, on the south bank of the River Tay, in a ceremony of submission that must have been deeply difficult for a man of Malcolm's pride. He swore an oath of fealty to William, acknowledging publicly and formally that he owed the Norman king a degree of loyalty that fundamentally qualified his own status as an independent monarch. He gave over his son Duncan, the boy he had had with his first wife Ingeborg, as a hostage to be held at the Norman court as a guarantee of his future behaviour, and Edgar Atheling was to be expelled from Scotland. Edgar went. He crossed to Flanders, the standard refuge of the European political exile in that period. His story did not end there. He would appear in the historical record at various moments over the next 3 decades, his name invoked by parties who needed a legitimate Wessex figurehead. But his story as a serious candidate for the English throne was over. William had been too thorough. The Norman settlement was too complete and too well defended. Edgar would eventually die in Flanders around 1125 in relative obscurity, the last male line representative of the old Wessex dynasty, a man whose entire life had been shaped by the gap between what his blood theoretically entitled him to and what the world was actually willing to give him. For Margaret, the Treaty of Abernethy was a moment of quiet grief. Her brother was expelled from the one country that had sheltered him with genuine warmth. Her husband had been publicly humbled. The implicit project that Malcolm's protection of Edgar had always carried, the long odds possibility that the Saxon cause might eventually find a moment, that Edgar might reclaim something, that the Norman settlement might somehow give way, was definitively closed. She accepted it, as she accepted most things she could not change, not passively, but by continuing to do the work that was actually within her reach. The work continued, the church councils continued, the children arrived, the priory at Dunfermline grew, the chapel at Edinburgh took shape, the ferry carried pilgrims. She continued because stopping was not in her character, and because the transformation of Scotland was not something that could be paused for political disappointment. Malcolm continued to press the English border in subsequent years. An invasion in 1079, skirmishes through the 1080s, another assault in 1091 that brought him into confrontation with William Rufus, the volatile and unpredictable son who had succeeded William the Conqueror on the English throne. Relations between the Scottish and English courts became, if anything, more fraught rather than less as the years passed. William Rufus was capable of a particular kind of personal insult that the older king had been too disciplined to indulge, and Malcolm felt the insult keenly. At some point in the early 1090s, Malcolm travelled south to the English court to pay the formal homage for his English lands that his political relationship with the English crown required. He was received, by his own account, as filtered through the Scottish sources, in a manner he found deeply contemptuous, denied the proper ceremonial respect that a king of Scotland had the right to expect, treated as a lesser figure, sent away without the audience and the acknowledgement he had come for. He came home with the particular focused anger of a proud man who has been publicly diminished. In 1093, he rode south for the last time. Before we reach the ending, and the ending comes quickly and without mercy, as the endings of great lives sometimes do, it is worth pausing to consider the legacy that Margaret was leaving in her living children. There were 8 of them. Edward, the eldest, born probably in the early 1070s, then Edmund, then Ethelred, then Edgar, then Alexander, then David, the youngest son, born around 1084, and 2 daughters, Edith, born around 1080, and Mary, born perhaps 2 years after her sister. They grew up in the household that Margaret had made, multilingual, spiritually serious, culturally sophisticated by the standards of 11th century Northern Europe. The court at Dunfermline, by the time the youngest of them were born, was a different place from the court that had existed before Margaret arrived. It was a court that took religion seriously, that treated learning with respect, that understood the production of beautiful things, embroidered vestments, illuminated books, as activities worthy of a queen's attention. It was, in short, a court shaped by Margaret's values, and the children who grew up in it absorbed those values as naturally as they absorbed the air and the language of the place. Margaret was deeply involved in her children's formation in ways that went beyond the conventional maternal role. She taught them herself, read scripture with them, brought them into her charitable practices so that they understood from their earliest years that the power available to them was a tool of service rather than a prize. She was preparing kings, and she knew it, and she approached the task with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything she believed in. Around 1086, she made a decision about her daughters. Edith, perhaps 6 years old, and Mary, perhaps 4, were sent to Romsey Abbey in the south of England. Romsey was a Benedictine convent, a fitting placement for the daughters of a queen formed by Benedictine tradition, and its abbess at that time was Christina, Margaret's own sister, who had fulfilled in her own life the vocation that Margaret had once so strongly desired. Under Christina's care, the 2 girls would receive an education that was, for women of their time and social standing, remarkable. Latin, theology, the scriptures, the arts of reading and writing, the kind of intellectual and spiritual formation that would prepare them for whatever futures history intended. Edith, the elder daughter, the one who would prove to be most unmistakably her mother's daughter, grew up in Christina's abbey into a young woman of considerable depth. She was, by the accounts that survive, beautiful and composed and deeply pious, and there was a period when it seemed genuinely possible that she would take religious vows and remain in the cloister. She wore the veil for a time, which would later create a complication when her name was put forward for a royal marriage, and questions arose about whether she had made binding promises she could not set aside. But history had not finished with the House of Wessex. In August of 1100, William Rufus died in the New Forest, shot by an arrow in circumstances that have never been fully explained to anyone's complete satisfaction, whether hunting accident or something more deliberate. He died childless. His younger brother moved immediately and became Henry I of England. Henry was more politically sophisticated than his brother, and he understood with clarity one of the fundamental challenges of his reign. He was a Norman king, ruling a country whose majority population was still Saxon, and the resentment and alienation of that population was a permanent political vulnerability. He wanted to marry into the Old English line. He wanted a queen who carried the blood of Wessex, who could stand before the English people as visible proof that the Norman and Saxon inheritances had been woven together, rather than one simply replacing the other. He sent for Edith. She came from Romsey. The questions about the veil she had worn were examined and resolved by Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury. She had worn it not as a binding religious profession, but as a practical protection during her years in the convent, and she had always understood it as such. The marriage was declared free to proceed. Edith and Henry I were married at Westminster Abbey in November of 1100. On the occasion of the marriage, Edith changed her name to Matilda. The name was more consonant with the Norman world she was entering, less obviously the name of a woman from the old Saxon tradition. She became Matilda, Queen of England, and the marriage was immediately and genuinely popular. The English people, the Saxon population who still constituted the majority and who had lived under Norman rule for 34 years, saw in their new queen the blood of Alfred and Ethelred and Edmund Ironside, the blood of the dynasty they had been taught to venerate, now sitting on the English throne in the person of the wife of a Norman king. The Norman Conquest and the Saxon inheritance were being joined. It was Margaret's achievement. The daughter she had educated at Romsey, raised in the tradition of prayer and learning and service, had become the Queen of England, and through her the dynastic thread of Wessex was woven into the Norman succession in a way that would prove permanent. Every subsequent English monarch has carried Margaret's blood through Matilda's descendants. The throne that twice failed to give a crown to a member of the House of Wessex would be ruled, for the rest of the medieval period and beyond, by people who were Wessex by descent. Back in Scotland, the sons were finding their places in the unfolding history of the kingdom. Edgar would eventually rule as King Edgar of Scotland from 1097 to 1107. In the turbulent aftermath of Malcolm's death, his reign was a period of stabilization rather than dramatic achievement, but stabilization after the chaos that followed 1093 was itself a significant accomplishment. Alexander followed as Alexander III, reigning from 1107 to 1124. He was a man of genuine religious seriousness, his mother's son in that regard, and one of the more significant acts of his reign was the appointment of Turgot himself as Bishop of St Andrews, the most senior ecclesiastical position in Scotland. It was a gesture that honoured both the old monk and the memory of the woman he had known and served across all the years of her queenship. And then came David. David Thares of Scotland ruled from 1124 to 1153, a reign of 30 years that was, in the estimation of many historians, the most transformative in Scottish history after the reigns of the earliest kings who had created the kingdom itself. David built monasteries across Scotland on a scale, and with a systematic enthusiasm that transformed the religious landscape of the country entirely. Augustinian canons, Cistercian monks, Tyrrhensian monks, Benedictine communities. David planted them everywhere, at Kelso and Melrose and Jedburgh and Holyrood and Cambus Kenneth, and half a dozen other foundations. He reformed Scottish law. He introduced Scotland's first coinage. He built the network of burghs, chartered market towns, that would form the foundation of Scotland's medieval economy. Under David, Scotland became recognisably what Margaret had imagined it could be, a kingdom fully connected to the broader world of Latin Christianity, governed by institutions that reflected the best of 12th century European practice, its church in full communion with Rome, and its monasteries filled with the kind of serious, reform-minded religious life that Margaret had worked to establish from the very beginning of her queenship. David was his mother's son, and he knew it. The Scotland he built was the Scotland she had dreamed of, grown to maturity in the fullness of time. She did not live to see any of it. She died when David was perhaps 9 years old, in the darkness and violence of November 1093. But she had shaped him, as she had shaped all of them, and through them she had shaped Scotland. November came early to Scotland in 1093, or so it must have seemed to the people watching from the towers of Edinburgh Castle, as the light shortened and the wind came off the Firth of Forth, with the particular cold insistence of a Scottish autumn that has decided to become winter. Malcolm gathered his army. He was 62 years old for a warrior king, old for a man whose life had been conducted in the field and the saddle. But his anger at William Rufus and his resentment of the humiliation he had received at the English court had not cooled. He was going south again. He had gone south 4 times before, and the English had not managed to stop him permanently. He would go a 5th time, make his point, and come back with his dignity restored. His eldest son Edward rode with him. Edward was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, trained for exactly this, the warrior prince riding to battle at his father's side, learning the trade of kingship in the most direct and unambiguous way available to the kings of Scotland. It was also a demonstration of dynastic continuity, the king and his heir together, presenting a unified and confident face to whatever England intended to put in front of them. They crossed the border. They moved through the countryside east of the Cheviot Hills, the great ridge of moorland that formed the natural boundary between the 2 kingdoms, and they took what they came to take: livestock, supplies, the tribute of a territory that Malcolm considered, by right of his own arm and the strength of his kingdom, available for the taking. And then they came to Alnwick. Alnwick Castle stood on a ridge above the River Aln in Northumberland, commanding the principal north-south route through the eastern borderlands. It was one of the most significant fortifications in the region, a strong point that had been given to Robert de Mowbray, the Earl of Northumbria, a capable, experienced Norman commander appointed precisely because the Scottish border required someone who understood how to manage it. Malcolm laid siege to the castle. He camped his main force on the sloping ground north of the river, in full view of the battlements, making his statement in the way that medieval siege warfare made its statements. I am here, I am strong, and you will eventually have to deal with me. He was not prepared for what happened on the morning of the 13th of November. It was St. Brice's Day, a feast of minor liturgical significance, but one that the chroniclers remembered when they wrote about what followed, because the name of the day was what the survivors had to anchor the memory to. Robert de Mowbray arrived with his forces. He had moved with a speed that the Scottish scouts had apparently failed to detect adequately. Perhaps the scouts were complacent after days of successful encampment. Perhaps the weather obscured the movement. Perhaps Mowbray was simply better at rapid manoeuvre than Malcolm's intelligence had accounted for. The English knight struck without warning, driving into the Scottish camp before the army could array itself into anything resembling a defensive formation. In the fighting, Malcolm was killed. The precise manner of his death is not recorded with the precision that later centuries might have wished. He fell in the battle, near the river, at the spot that would afterwards be called Malcolm's Spring, or Malcolm's Well. His son Edward was mortally wounded in the same engagement, dying of his wounds shortly after the battle. The spring near which they fell was named and remembered, and for a time people came to mark the place. A modest stone still marks it. The Scottish army, suddenly without its king or its prince, lost its cohesion. It turned and moved back north toward the border, carrying its wounded and its grief. Among the survivors was another of Malcolm's sons, Edgar, who had been present at the battle and escaped alive, though wounded. He began the journey back toward Edinburgh to carry the news. At Edinburgh Castle, Margaret was dying. This is not a retrospective interpretation imposed on the events by later storytellers. The sources that are closest to the primary events are consistent that by November of 1093, Margaret had been seriously ill for some time. The accumulated toll of her life, the years of fasting and reduced sleep, the 8 pregnancies, the unceasing physical demands of the charitable work she had maintained without interruption throughout her queenship, had brought her to a point where the body she had spent her adult life giving away had very little left to give. She was 47 years old. She was lying in Edinburgh Castle. She was holding the Black Rood. One of her sons arrived. Accounts in the different sources name either Edmund or Edgar, and we cannot settle the question with certainty. And he brought her the news from the south. Malcolm was dead. Their eldest son Edward was dead. The army was coming back without its king. What happened next is recorded in the devotional tradition with a vividness that suggests it struck those present as extraordinary. Margaret received the news in prayer. She did not collapse, did not lose herself in the grief that the news demanded. She prayed. She turned the knowledge toward God. She gave thanks. There is a reading of this response that could seem cold, or inhuman, or simply incredible. A woman receiving the news of her husband's death and her son's death, and thanking God for it. But that reading misses the theology entirely, and it misses the person. Margaret had spent her entire adult life practicing the surrender of her own will to God's, not as an abstract spiritual exercise, but as a daily, physical, costly reality, enacted every morning before dawn, and every midnight in prayer, and every hour of charity through all the years of her queenship. The practice of that surrender did not make grief impossible. It made it possible to receive even grief as a gift. Not a gift she would have chosen, not a gift she welcomed in any ordinary sense, but a gift nonetheless, the last thing that could be taken from her, held up and given back to the God who had given her everything. She received the worst news of her life and she prayed, and she let go. She died on the 16th of November, 1093, 3 days after Malcolm fell at Alnwick. Edinburgh Castle was not, at that moment, a peaceful place. Malcolm's brother Donald Bain, who had been watching from outside the family, who had his own claim to the Scottish throne, and who understood that Malcolm's death had created an opportunity, had moved quickly. The castle was besieged, or at least threatened, by forces that wanted to prevent Margaret's sons from consolidating their position. The accounts say that Margaret's sons were trapped inside with their mother's body, that the castle was surrounded, that the doors between them and their freedom were closed. But then the mist came down. The autumn mists of Edinburgh are real and thick and capable, under the right conditions, of reducing visibility to a few feet. Whether what happened that night was a natural weather event or something the tradition has shaped into something more, the accounts agree. In the mist, Margaret's sons carried their mother's body out of the castle. They moved through or past the forces outside, guided by the mist or through it, and they made their way west and north toward Dunfermline, toward the priory she had founded and the church she had built above the earlier, simpler building that had stood on that site before she came, toward the place she had always said she wanted to be buried. They carried her through the mist, and they brought her to Dunfermline, and they laid her before the high altar. It was what she had asked for. Pilgrims began arriving at Margaret's tomb in Dunfermline almost immediately after her burial. The tradition of her sanctity did not wait for papal confirmation or official designation. It started at the grassroots, in the ordinary way that genuine popular devotion always starts, from person to person, from one testimony of experience to another, from the mouths of people who had been at her charitable works or had received her direct attention, or had simply lived in the kingdom she had spent 23 years remaking. She had been called Saint by those who knew her since before she died. The informal title became more widely used after her death, and it spread through the population of Scotland in the organic way that such things spread, without institutional direction, without official endorsement, simply because the people who had known her and the people who had heard about her believed it, and said so, and the saying spread. The miracles began. The tomb at Dunfermline became a destination for people who were sick or desperate or afraid, who came because they had heard that something happened at this place, that prayers offered here received answers, that the woman buried under this altar had not simply ended when she died. The miracle accounts accumulated over the following decades. The pilgrimage traffic grew. Dunfermline became one of the significant pilgrimage sites of medieval Scotland, drawing the devout not just from within the country, but from beyond its borders. Meanwhile, in England, Matilda was building her own legacy as Henry's queen, and fulfilling the commission she had given herself in the years immediately after her mother's death. She had asked Turgot to write the formal account of Margaret's life. Turgot, who had been Margaret's confessor and closest spiritual confidant, who had watched her from the inside of her trust across all the years of her queenship, produced between approximately 1100 and 1107 his Vita Margaritae, the life of Saint Margaret, Queen of the Scots. It was written from Matilda's eyes, shaped by Matilda's grief and Matilda's love, and Matilda's determined intention that the record of her mother's life should survive and be known. The Vita became, and has remained, the essential primary source for everything we know about Margaret as a person, her daily habits, her inner life, the texture of her devotion, the quality of her relationship with Malcolm, the nature of her charity. Without it, we would have only charters and chronicle entries. With it, we have the woman. Matilda also gave England a dynasty that would change the course of British history. Her children, with Henry III, included a daughter named for her, known to history as the Empress Matilda, who would in the next generation fight a prolonged and bitter civil war with her cousin Stephen for the English throne. The civil war was not resolved in Matilda's favour, but it was resolved through her son. Henry II of England, the first Plantagenet king, was Matilda's son and therefore Margaret's great-grandson. Through Henry II and his descendants, Richard I, John, Henry III, and all the long succession of English and later British monarchs that follows, every subsequent ruler of England has carried in their lineage the blood of the exiled Hungarian princess who had washed feet at the gates of Edinburgh Castle on cold Scottish mornings 9 centuries ago. The throne that twice refused to give a crown to the House of Wessex has been ruled, from Henry II onward, by people who are Wessex by descent. The circle closed in the most unexpected way possible, not through Edgar Atheling, the nominal king who never reigned, not through any act of political will or military success, but through Margaret's daughter, through the marriage to Henry III, through the children of that marriage, through the slow, patient, generational working out of a bloodline that outlasted every political obstacle placed in its way. In Scotland, the sons completed what their mother had begun. David the Fairskars, the youngest son, the child who had perhaps been most directly shaped by Margaret's personal care in the years before her death, proved to be the most complete embodiment of her vision. His reign, from 1124 to 1153, was transformative in the deepest sense, not merely politically or militarily successful, but genuinely reformative of the character of Scottish Christianity and Scottish civil governance. The monasteries he founded spread the kind of serious, reform-minded monastic Christianity across Scotland that Margaret had first introduced through those 3 Benedictine monks sent by Lanfranc of Canterbury decades earlier. Kelso, Melrose, Jedburgh, Holyrood, Cambus Kenneth, Dundrennan. The list of David's religious foundations reads like a map of a kingdom being systematically covered with houses of prayer. The Dunfermline Priory was elevated to a full Benedictine abbey in 1128, giving formal institutional status to the community that Margaret had planted at the beginning of her queenship. The Scottish Church was brought into full connection with the wider European Church, its practices standardized, its clergy educated, its relationship with Rome established on a firm and lasting foundation. David the Further was, in the truest sense, his mother's son. He knew it. His contemporaries knew it. The Scotland he left at his death in 1153 was the Scotland that Margaret had imagined from the very beginning. Time passed. Scotland continued to change and to grow. Decades became a century, and then another. The pilgrimage to Dunfermline continued. The miracle accounts accumulated. The cult of Saint Margaret grew wider and deeper in the popular devotion of the Scottish people, and eventually, as happened with the great saints of the medieval church, the question of formal recognition arose. In 1246, King Alexander II of Scotland, himself a direct descendant of Margaret, 6 generations removed through the unbroken royal line, wrote formally to Rome. He addressed his petition to Pope Innocent IV and presented the case for his ancestors' canonization. He described her life and her works. He presented the evidence of the miracles attributed to her intercession. He submitted the testimony of those who had experienced or witnessed those miracles. He asked the Church to declare formally what the people of Scotland had been saying informally for a century and a half. The process moved through the proper channels. Inquiries were made. Evidence was examined. The theologians and canonists of the papal court reviewed the case with the thoroughness that the formal process demanded, and on the 16th of September 1249, Pope Innocent IV declared Margaret of Scotland a saint of the Catholic Church. Her feast day was set at the 16th of November, the anniversary of her death, the day she had died holding the Black Rood in the besieged castle, 3 days after the news from Alnwick. The formal celebrations in Scotland took place in 1250, in a ceremony of translation, the moving of her remains from their original resting place to a magnificent new shrine prepared for the purpose. The reliquary that was made for her was a casket of silver and precious stones, worthy of the woman and the occasion. The procession to the new shrine moved through the abbey, carrying the casket, past the columns and the choir, and the accumulated prayers of 57 years of pilgrimage. And when the procession reached the point in the building where Malcolm's remains rested, as it came to the tomb of the warrior king who had washed feet beside her at the castle gates, the bier became too heavy to carry. The bearers could not move it forward. They stopped, they thought, and someone understood what was happening. Malcolm's remains were exhumed and placed alongside Margaret's in the procession, and then it moved again, forward and together, to the new shrine where they were reinterred side by side. Whether this was miracle or beautiful legend, it says something true about them. They had lived together for 23 years, through all the complexity of a marriage between two people who were almost entirely different from each other, held together by his love and her faith, and the shared work they had done. They were buried together at Dunfermline, as she had asked, and as he deserved, the warrior king and the saint, side by side under the altar of the abbey they had made. The centuries brought changes, as centuries do. Margaret's relics were distributed through churches across Scotland as acts of pious patronage and devotion. Her head, the most sacred of the separate relics, passed through a remarkable series of custodies over the following centuries. By 1560, it had come into the possession of Mary Queen of Scots, who held it with great reverence and credited Margaret's heavenly intercession with helping her through the difficulties of childbirth. Mary was not alone in this belief. The story of Margaret's continued active presence in the lives of those who called on her was a persistent and apparently genuine feature of Scottish Catholic devotion. The relic eventually came to rest with the Jesuits at their Scots College in Douai, France, a community of Scottish Catholics in exile during the upheavals of the Reformation period, maintaining their faith and their traditions across the water, as the House of Wessex had once maintained its identity across the water in Hungary. And then the French Revolution came, with its systematic destruction of religious institutions and its dispersal of sacred objects accumulated over centuries, and Margaret's head was lost. It is presumed destroyed. It has never been recovered. The other relics that had been distributed through the churches of Scotland met largely the same fate during the Scottish Reformation of the 16th century. The Reformers, with their deep theological objection to the veneration of physical objects as vehicles of sacred power, swept through the abbeys and priories of Scotland and dismantled the apparatus of Catholic devotion that had grown up over 500 years. Dunfermline Abbey itself was stripped and partially destroyed. The magnificent silver and gem-encrusted shrine that had been made for Margaret's canonization was broken up. The relics were scattered or destroyed, but the nave of the great medieval abbey still stands. It stands today, roofless in sections, open to the Scottish sky, the massive Norman columns dark with the moisture of countless Scottish seasons. And if you look up at the tower at the eastern end, you can read the inscription that runs around it in enormous carved letters, King Robert the Bruce. For Bruce is buried at Dunfermline too, as so many of the kings of Scotland were buried there across the medieval centuries, in the church that Margaret built over the priory that she planted, in the place that she made holy, and that the centuries of pilgrimage confirmed, and below the streets of the modern town of Dunfermline, accessible to visitors, maintained with careful attention, visited in a continuous stream since the 11th century, is Saint Margaret's Cave, the small hollow in the rock where the Queen would retreat before dawn, when the castle was asleep and the chaplains were not yet stirring, and the world had not yet made its first demands on her. She prayed there in the silence that her queenship made perpetually difficult to find elsewhere. The cave has been cared for and visited for nearly 1,000 years. People still go to it, and on the highest point of Edinburgh Castle, on the great black volcanic rock above the city, in the oldest corner of the whole enormous fortress complex that has grown up there over the centuries, stands Saint Margaret's Chapel. Simple, small, the proportions of a building made by someone who understood that God does not need grandeur, only sincerity. The walls are thick and the stone is dark and the windows are narrow and the light inside has a quality that the architects of later centuries, with all their resources, have found very difficult to reproduce. People are still married in it. Children are baptized in it. Families gather in it to mark the ordinary and extraordinary passages of their lives under a roof that has been sheltering those passages for nearly 1,000 years. In 1673, the formal designation came. Margaret was named the patron saint of Scotland. The designation acknowledged something that had been true in the hearts of the Scottish people since the winter of 1093. She is venerated to this day as patron of Scotland, and also of widows, of queens, of nurses, of large families, of those engaged in learning, and of those who serve the poor. Read that list slowly, and you have a portrait of the person. Widows, because she was one at the end, holding her cross in a besieged castle, and she faced it without flinching. Queens, because she was one for 23 years, and she used every day of those years in the service of her people. Nurses, because she nursed the sick herself, with her own hands, because she got up in the night to attend to those who needed attending to. Large families, because she raised 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters, and raised them to be kings and queens, who carried her values forward into the world. Learning, because she read and educated her children, and built a priory and a culture in which learning was valued and sustained. And those who serve the poor, because she served the poor every day with her own hands before she ate for 23 years. Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, founded in 1875, was named in her honour. The towns of North and South Queensferry carry the name of the woman who arranged a free crossing for pilgrims 9.5 centuries ago. The chapel on the rock still stands and still shelters those who come to it. Her gospel book rests in Oxford, in a library that has held it safely for centuries, decorated by hands that prayed over it before they painted it, preserved by the chain of custodians who understood what they were holding. And on the 16th of November, every year, the Church sets aside the day to remember a woman who came to Scotland by storm or by plan, who wanted to be a nun and became a queen instead, who wore herself down in the service of God and her people and died at 47, holding the one thing she had always held, the black rood, the container of the cross, the physical centre of her faith, and who has been called Saint Margaret ever since by the country she made her own. And so, gently, we arrive at the end of Margaret's story, a life that began in exile, in a castle in the southern hills of Hungary, in a family defined by what it had lost and sustained by what it refused to let go, a childhood formed in a court shaped by the memory of a holy king, an adolescence at the English court of a great uncle who was running out of time, a flight north through storm and darkness to a country at the edge of the world, a marriage to a warrior king who surprised himself with the depth of his love for a woman so utterly unlike him. 2 decades of extraordinary, sustained, unglamorous daily work. For the church she reformed, for the poor she fed, for the children she raised, for the country she had never chosen and came to love with everything she had. And then November, and Alnwick, and 3 days, and the mist, and Dunfermline. She was 47 years old when she died. She had spent those 47 years in the service of a faith she had held since childhood and never let go, through exile and loss and a marriage she had not sought, and a queenship she had not wanted, and a reform she had not been asked for, but had undertaken anyway because she could see it needed to be done. She fed orphans and washed feet, and built abbeys, and argued theology with bishops, and corresponded with archbishops, and raised 3 kings of Scotland and the Queen of England, and all the while rose at midnight to pray. She had wanted to be a nun. Instead, she was given Scotland. And Scotland, rough, Gaelic, Celtic, complicated Scotland, received her and was changed by her and remembered her and called her saint, and has been calling her that for nearly 1,000 years. If you have found rest tonight in the telling of her story, if the quiet hours of this journey through her life have carried you gently towards sleep, then something of the spirit she carried has, in its small way, done its work once more. A gentle like and a quiet comment, if you have a moment before you drift off, mean a great deal to our growing Sleepy Crown family. If you have enjoyed tonight's journey and want to find more stories like this one, other lives, other centuries, other voices from the long and extraordinary human past, told slowly and with care, they are waiting for you here on this channel. Sleep well. We will be here when you wake. Good night.